Hello and welcome once more to the study here at the Vicarage at St Francis Church in Stoke-on-Trent. Following on from our last course presented on our YouTube channel, which is still available to view, we're now starting our new course, which will last for 5 sessions, one per week. In this course, we shall be considering one of the thorniest and most intractable problems in all of philosophy and theology, that of the existence of evil and suffering in the world. As both a priest and as a teacher, I have been challenged as to the existence of God many times by both children and adults, using many different arguments and approaches. One of the most common relates to supposed opposition between religion and science, particularly as it's held to occur in the realm of creation, unguided evolution by chance, as opposed to some sort of divinely guided and authored series of events. Excuse me. However, the greatest challenge, I think, to the Christian concept of God actually relates not to this area, important though it is, but to the age-old difficulty of reconciling belief in a loving God as described in the Christian scriptures and tradition with the very real and obvious existence of evil and suffering in the world. Why, it is objected, would a loving, all-powerful God permit such evil things, so much human suffering, to exist at all? Surely he would act to prevent them. Now, I think that unless we honestly face up to the power of such objections, we really have nothing of any value to say to a broken world. We need to accept the radical challenge that such a view presents to us. Pious platitudes about God still loving us, even in the face of so much suffering, just won't cut it. As Christians, we have to be prepared to admit that we have no easy answers, to admit that those answers we can suggest are but tentative explorations. And yet, they're far, far better than any atheistic responses, for these, at the end of the day, are but hollow and ineffectual admissions that there can be no satisfactory resolution to the problem. And in fact, they create a whole new raft of problems. Be that as it may, Christians about to engage with a post-pandemic world, which is going to be, like it or not, in many ways radically different from the world we've known until now. We need to be able to speak words of hope and comfort. And these words must flow from a conviction that not only does God love us in spite of appearances to the contrary, but that he has also given us the intellectual gifts for us to be able to confront the very real challenges we face concerning both the existence and nature of God. In the very new and crucial missionary situation in which we find ourselves, we cannot afford to fail to grapple with these problems. Now, over the course of the next few weeks, we shall be dealing, albeit at a fairly simple level, with a number of aspects of the problem and its potential, although admittedly provisional, solutions. We shall range over a number of facets, understanding that they are no more than pointers and that in the time available we can do little more than scratch the surface, whilst hopefully indicating some practical suggestions for discussion with genuinely perplexed atheists. Today, in this first session, we'll consider what evil and suffering actually are. What is it that we actually mean when we talk about suffering? Is there really such a thing as evil at all? And does it even make sense to think that there might be a resolution to the problem? Next week, in the session, we'll focus on the question of the culpability of a divine creator for the existence of evil and suffering, and look at some early attempts, particularly in the Old Testament, as well as some other early societies beyond it, to grapple with the problem. In weeks 3 and 4, we'll deal with the ideas stemming from the thought realms of first Augustine of Hippo, and secondly, from Irenaeus of Lyon. And finally, in week 5, we'll focus on the place of Jesus in the debate and try to point to some sort of tentatively satisfactory resolution to the difficulties we must face. So, what is suffering? I suppose that we all have some experience of what it is to suffer. It seems to be an inescapable part of the human condition that we do suffer. Yet it's actually quite difficult to arrive at even an acceptable definition of what it is, still less an agreed understanding of what it actually entails and what it feels like to suffer. A dictionary definition of suffering might be, for example, unaccountable physical or mental pain, or feelings of pain and unhappiness. Yet in itself, this tells us remarkably little. It begs a further question as what do we mean by pain and unhappiness? How can we, as the Prince of my theological college will say, unpack this and helicopter in on it? We probably all think we know what these terms entail, but do we really comprehend their full significance? At the end of the day, suffering is something which is experienced, and of necessity, no one is privy to the actual experiences of others. We might say, I know how you're feeling, but do we really? The suffering and hurt we all experience have something in common, yes. But can we ever fully experience what someone's suffering actually feels like to them? I suppose we can agree that someone's feeling of pain, be it physical or emotional, mental or spiritual, may be similar to those of others in near identical circumstances, enough for us to feel some empathy with the other, even if we can never actually experience the identical feelings themselves as they're experienced by the one who is suffering. Certainly, suffering would seem to involve deep feelings of hurt and pain, which is something we have all experienced in some way or another. In one sense, I suppose, the most we can say is that whilst we may struggle to adequately explain what suffering actually is, we all know what it means to actually experience suffering, even if we can never adequately experience the suffering of the other. When we talk of suffering, we know what it is, precisely because we have known it personally. Suffering, we realise, may have any number of causes, the most obvious of which are physical causes. Being creatures of flesh and blood, we feel physical pain when our bodies are under some sort of external attack. Of course, we realise that sometimes this pain has a beneficial purpose. When I feel dental pain, it's an indication that not all is well with my teeth, and my body is telling me to see the dentist. However, much physical pain is actually inflicted with the intention of causing the pain. When my daughter was little, she pulled our cat's tail, and quite naturally the cat scratched her fairly nastily. She learned from that never to pull the cat's tail again. Now this was a defensive mechanism kicking in, the cat warning Hannah against causing her pain. Both of these are understandable, if unpleasant, causes of physical and to extent mental suffering, and do not really pose as much of a problem. The suffering has a beneficial pedagogic effect. The real problem of such suffering seems to be when it can have no real beneficial effect. My cat's a different cat. Will be very long-lived. My cat kills mice. The cat enjoys doing so. Now, for me, it serves the purpose of ending a health and safety hazard. And, of course, no doubt it serves to entertain the cat. However, what possible beneficial effect is there for the mouse? It suffers extremes of physical pain and terror before finally having its life extinguished. How does this in any way benefit? Or why did dinosaurs suffer from arthritis, which the physical evidence clearly demonstrates? It might be possible to make an argument that humans suffer as a result of sinning against God. But in what way would it even make sense to say that of a dinosaur? As a dinosaur acts in a dinosaur-like way, because that's what his nature is. It can do no other. If you like, God has created it that way. Why then should it have the misery of arthritis thrust upon it when it cannot even begin to comprehend what that is? Why should it have to undergo pain and then either starve to death because it can no longer outrun its prey, or become prey for other creatures as it can no longer outrun or outfight them? Why should nature be red in tooth and claw? Now, this is a real and greatly underestimated problem. It seems to give the lie to the Christian belief in a loving God. Most of the countless billions of animals which have ever lived have ended up as something else's lunch. If God exists and loves his creation, if he is good, how is it that he even permits, never mind designs, such appalling suffering, such throes of agony throughout history, throughout creation? It makes more sense in the face of such evidence to argue that God, if he exists, is a sick, sadistic torturer who revels in the agony and terror of his creation. No Christian who considers the problem with any degree of seriousness can deny the force of this objection. As we shall see, there are answers, but whether they're at all satisfactory is an entirely different matter. It's my own contention, along with a number of scholars working in the field, that this is the single most serious objection to the Christian notion of God, save possibly the idea of the existence of eternal hell. Now, of course, suffering cannot be limited to merely physical manifestations. Other forms of suffering are equally as distressing, and in many cases even more so. The very real anguish brought about by bereavement, redundancy, mocking, humiliation, or even unrequited love must not be lightly dismissed. Just because people react very differently to these and other forms of suffering is no is no reason to downplay the seriousness of each of these to those who are experiencing the suffering they bring about. Suffering seems to be an inescapable part of both human and animal experience, and it is something we must all of necessity experience. Left unaddressed, it's probably a killer argument against the existence of God, and therefore it deserves to be treated by us as Christians with the utmost seriousness. Moving on, we can ask, what is evil? Now, the problem of the existence of evil, although it certainly overlaps with the foregoing, is in part actually, in some respects, less of a problem for Christians. Evil can be divided, broadly speaking, into two parts: natural evil and moral evil. Of the two, the existence of natural evil, which must include animal suffering, is actually much harder to deal with than is moral evil, although many people would initially consider this to be the reverse of reality. So what is natural evil? Well, we've already discussed a lot of it. This is evil to the extent that it causes pain and suffering to sentient creatures. It occurs naturally as part of the fabric of the world. It includes the problems we mentioned earlier, but also those such as, why do earthquakes and floods occur? Why are the pains of old age allowed? Why does ultimately death have to happen to every living creature? And there are many others. These are sufferings or evils which are not caused by a human agency. They just happen. They are part of the fabric of the world which we inhabit. Turning to moral evil, when one talks of evil, this is what most people mean. It is that choice and suffering deliberately caused by humans through their moral choices. The pain brought about by an act of murder, the horrors of war, the suffering caused by economic greed or by hatred of a race, class or group, the appalling and often lifelong suffering brought about by acts of bullying, or even the thoughtlessness and disregard of others. All these fall under the category of moral evil, the evil that is the product of the exercise of our free will. And surprisingly, although many people find it hugely problematic, this form of evil is actually easier for us as Christians to address. However, I want to ask before we deal with these things in the following weeks, does moral evil actually exist? Now, at first sight, that seems like a really stupid question. Even a cursory examination of the daily news can answer that one. It's clear that human actions often bring about tremendous suffering, and that this is caused by the very deliberate actions of people, and they're designed to cause maximal amounts of suffering. One thing to think only of Hitler and the Holocaust. So the answer to that one is obvious. Yet, reflection can make us pause. What makes an act evil? Suppose, as an example from history, innocent people were torn from their homes, forced to the top of a pyramid, and there had their chests cut open, their beating hearts wrenched from their bodies, were decapitated, and their lifeless corpses cast headlong down the pyramid steps. Is that evil? Yes, virtually everyone would cry. But is it? After all, the Aztecs found nothing wrong with it. They did it, and they were merely obeying what their society held to be blindingly obvious. The sacrifice of humans, the shedding of blood, was necessary to ensure the daily rising of the sun. And after all, who but a fool would want to risk it not rising? On a more mundane level, some years ago, quite a lot of years ago now, a missionary to Japan described to me the shock he felt, the feelings of, I suppose, unease, um, when on seeing an old lady's shopping bag burst open in the middle of a busy street that she was crossing, he naturally went to her aid to help her gather up her goods and remove them from the road. Nobody else seemed to come to her aid. He was a bit puzzled by that. And then she was distraught. She was crying with shame at his helping her. He had caused her to lose much face publicly, something which in her society was unforgivable. So, what makes an action evil or even just wrong, particularly in the absence of the divine? If there is no God, surely any action boils down to personal choice. If there's a God, then an action may be good or evil depending on the God's commands, on the way he has structured the human person. But if there's no God, surely any action at the end of the day boils down to personal choice. You may say it's society which decides if an action is evil. But which society? Ours in the 21st century? What about in the Nazi era? German society considered it not only acceptable, but even highly commendable to torment, assault, and even kill Jewish people and other Untermenschen, other subhumans. What made that wrong? We would say it is wrong, but what made it wrong? Is it evil merely because our society disapproved of it? Wouldn't that just make us racists ourselves? Though what would be wrong with that? Why is it wrong to be a racist if there is no God? And anyway, didn't our own society approve of treating other races as inferior, even at the same time? Wasn't it Winston Churchill who favoured the RAF gas bombing villagers in what is now Iran, Iraq? Who invented the concentration camps anyway? That would be us British. Pack of hypocrites. Without an external reference for moral actions, which can ultimately only be found in the divine, all moral actions just boil down in the end to murder, yuck, or murder, yay. Certain rules may or may not be conducive to the orderly running of the state, but they cannot simply be foisted on others unless by a sheer exercise of brute power. Why do we consider it right that in war prisoners are treated humanely? But in Japan during the Second World War, no such imperative existed. Prisoners could effectively be used in any way. What makes one right and the other wrong. This, therefore, has sometimes been known as the Ya-Bu theory of ethics. Murder Ya or murder Bu. There is no right or wrong, no good or evil, just group, and ultimately just personal choice. If this is your position, fine. It doesn't mean you can't be moral, you just have no ultimate ground of morality. And in which case, just be prepared to accept the consequences. In a very real sense, an atheist is forced into agreeing that there must be a God, or else they have to bite the bullet and accept the very unpalatable truth that there can be no such thing as good, evil, or objective morality. However, as satisfying for the Christian though that may be, the distinct possibility remains that the atheist's underlying premise that there is no God remains true, and that although I'm willing to swallow the bullet, to bite the bullet on morality, that is the ultimate nature of reality. Now, having briefly, and it is very briefly as an introduction, considered the scope of this course and spent a bit of time briefly examining the nature of both suffering and evil, we've also considered whether, if atheism is correct that there is no God, it's meaningful to even talk about an objective morality. I conclude that in the absence of an ultimate external arbiter of moral actions, a God, that is indeed incorrect to see moral actions as being either right or wrong. Such terms must ultimately be a matter of personal preference, and that is all. In our next session, we'll begin to consider the task of extricating God from blame for the existence of evil and suffering by looking at some of the early attempts at reconciling the notion of a fundamentally good God with the very real experience, the lived human experience of these appalling realities. So please do join us next time, and in the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. God bless you. Good night.